Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar on this snowy day. I don't know how it's snowing again in Boston, but we're back on a snowy day. So hopefully everyone's staying warm and gets to hang out here for 45 minutes to an hour. I'm excited to welcome Scott and George today, who have both helped us in numerous ways with different land underwriting projects that we've been a part of over the past handful of years. I put these webinars together really based on what I'm interested in, right? What we're hearing from our clients, the questions that we're getting, but also, it's getting the people out to you that we call when we don't know what to do, right? It's, hey, is this a wetland or is this an upland? Is this buildable? Is this not buildable? What can we build on this site? So those are the questions that we're hoping to help you answer today. A lot of the people that we run into that have land questions, perhaps they inherited that land, perhaps you've got some land at the back of your warehouse that you're wondering what you can do with. Maybe you bought some land because it was a really good value 20 years ago or 2 months ago, and you want to figure out what you can do with it. So what I'm hoping to set up with this call is a framework for some of the first steps that you might take to see, is this buildable? What can I build on it? What's it going to cost me to build on it? What studies do I need? With that information in hand, someone like myself can help you with evaluation. Banks can help you with, can you go out and get debt to go build your building? All those things fall once you get some understanding of what is this site good for. First, today I want to start with Scott. Scott is the founder and owner of Goddard Consultants. They do different engineering projects, and we especially have leaned on them for wetland studies. Scott, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Harrison. So again, Scott Goddard, Goddard Consulting. I'm a professional wetland scientist. That's the PWS. I've been in the industry, focus heavily in New England, but even more specifically in Massachusetts for 30 years. We have multiple offices throughout the state and a large team of consulting wetland scientists, wildlife biologists, soil scientists. So we specialize in ecological considerations that have regulatory triggers for land use. So our objective is to help you to understand your land, whether you're an existing owner or a prospective buyer. Where is there added value that can be obtained through your property? Are there opportunities for expansion? How do you have to preserve it going into the future? What regulatory triggers come about if you want to perform certain activities? Does it trigger a Conservation Commission application, something with DEP, or even further, at the federal level? So there's a whole bunch of regulatory triggers for ecological considerations for all land owners. So when people come to me and talk about environmental issues and valuation or usability of commercial property, I see that there are three main areas of focus that dictate usability and value of commercial land. The first one is wetlands. Wetlands, and I'm going to go into a little bit more, have a wide definition of what that word means. It means something different to the United States of America under federal law. It means something different under, in this case, say Massachusetts state law under the Mass Wetland Protection Act. It means something different if you're in an individual town. I'm sitting here in the town of Northborough, Massachusetts. A wetland in Northborough might be different than a wetland in Southborough or Hopkinton or any other town in the Commonwealth, where there's local bylaws at play. So all of these overlap jurisdictions, and it's important to understand it because the wetlands we have over 30% land area in Massachusetts taken up by wetlands. So it's literally classification of the land cover types based on usable uplands as contrasted to wetlands that are largely unbuildable areas of sites. The other one that goes often overlooked is rare and endangered species, right? So it's not just wetlands. There's a separate layer of oversight in, say, here in Massachusetts. The Massachusetts Endangered Species Act, MESA, protects rare and endangered animals, like this is a box turtle, plants, birds. We're working on some projects right now that involve moths, fish, turtle, I mean, all the things, right? So anything that's protected under state law or in some cases federal law have certain land use constraints on property, not quite as widespread as wetlands. And the last environmental factor that affects land use value is hazardous waste. I'm not going to talk about hazardous waste today. That's its own specialty niche. I work with a lot of hazardous waste consultants. You hear the term 21E or doing a phase 1 site assessment. A lot of times this is getting clearance from the banks that they feel confident investing in property and putting loans against property. They don't want to be buying sites that have high levels of risk, or they want to understand the risk very well before they lend. So 21E or phase 1s come up a lot for land use. So that's something I can always connect you to a hazardous waste or 21E specialist, but that's not what my focus is. I'm going to talk about those first two, wetlands and rare species. Okay, so what is a wetland? Wetlands are largely misunderstood in what I find by most folks. We think about a wetland, most people are thinking something that I'm getting my feet wet in. I might, need to wear muck boots to walk through. Maybe it's just a creek, maybe it's just a pond. But in Massachusetts, we have, a very sort of, I would say, complex system of defining what is and isn't a wetland. It's tied with understanding the types of vegetation that's growing on the ground, and is that the kind of vegetation that likes or dislikes water. So you think of something like a cattail or a skunk cabbage or something like this, right? Where you're used to seeing those things in a wet area. But then there's other types of species that will grow in upland forested areas, but also in wetland forested areas, like a blueberry bush or something. And does that mean it's a wetland or not a wetland? So each plant has its own characterization if it represents a wetland, but it's also coupled with what's going on below the ground surface. So a wetland doesn't necessarily just have water at the surface. It can have water at or near the surface that is supporting wetland characteristics. And the reverse is also true. There are situations where you could have standing water at the surface at certain times of the year under certain conditions, and it's not a wetland, right? There's areas that can be floodplains or temporarily ponded areas that don't meet the definition of a wetland. So the presence or absence of water does not necessarily dictate the presence or absence of a wetland, but it is a factor for sure. So then there's other things that are zones, I would say, that are considered wetland resources or protected under wetland laws that aren't the wetlands themselves. So that first category I talked about, bordering vegetated wetlands, it's not just the wetland itself that's protected. There's a 100-foot buffer zone by state law adjacent to it that has certain regulatory thresholds for when and when not permits are required to do any work within those zones. Like, let's say, for example, you have a parking lot in your commercial property. It's adjacent to a wetland. Do you need a permit to do normal maintenance to that parking lot? Are you allowed to sand it and plow it? Is the snow only allowed to go in certain areas? These things come into place where you have certain allowances for maintenance of existing conditions, but certain activities are going to trigger permits. Like, for example, let's say you wanted to repave your parking lot, right? Or how much repair could you do to, say, for example, a parking lot or a loading dock or something that's adjacent to a wetland without triggering a permit to the conservation versus triggering a permit to the Conservation Commission. So these are important questions to ask. Riverfront areas, likewise, they don't go just 100 feet from the edge of a river. They go 200 feet on both sides of a river. So if you have a stream that runs year round, we call those a river in this case, there's a zone 200 feet on either side, so 400 feet wide. That is a huge swath of land area that cuts through a piece of property. And there's limitations on what's allowed and what's not allowed within those riverfront areas. But there's certain exemptions, things that don't count against you. For example, if you have stormwater management features within riverfront areas, that doesn't count against your usable area that you're allowed to consider for within riverfront. So every one of these zones has its own little world of what is and isn't allowed, and figuring out how to get the best value out of your property requires properly characterizing all these. So this was an example here when I said earlier, just because something has standing water doesn't necessarily mean it's a wetland, right? So You might have had, in this case of this picture, a little stream that runs through the backside of this. Perhaps it's a golf course or a public park or some such thing. But then you might have a culvert restriction. You might have an area where the water is limited by the road overtopping elevation or something. And then after you get a big storm, you get a 4-inch rainstorm, a 5-inch rainstorm. A 100-year storm is a 7.5+ inch rainstorm. You can get floodplain areas that go out adjacent to wetlands that are protected in different ways, but aren't themselves a wetland. If you have a commercial property that's within a FEMA zone, you might think of it needing floodplain insurance. That's one way that people often become alerted to the fact that their property, may be within a floodplain. As a side note, I'll just stick this in there. There's also ways to sometimes remove the need for floodplain, very expensive floodplain insurance from your property by going through a process and determining, is my building actually in the floodplain or not? Or are we just using presumptive maps done by FEMA? Or can we do an on-the-ground survey, get those maps changed, and remove the floodplain insurance? I see that happen a lot. There's a process to go through that. So when I talk about wetlands, I'm talking about this whole category of land use features that have regulatory thresholds under in this case, the Mass Wetland Protection Act, and then often local bylaws in addition. All right. So here's an example. So let's just take this arbitrary piece of property. This is sourced from Mass Mapper. It's a publicly available tool online where you can sort of see aerial photographs with some overlay data on top of different land areas. You can look up your own house, you can look up your business or any investment properties that you own and get a sense as to what is going on in the property, at least at a presumptive level by the state mapping. So this is a public park area. There's parking lots and there's fields. It could just as well be a commercial property that involves buildings, a solar field. It could be any type of land use, we'll say, that's non-residential. And you say, okay, here's a 7-acre parcel of land. I go, okay, I have some fields. I got a parking lot over here. I got some pathways. Oh, but I have this forested land to the rear. Can I do additional work on the property? Could I expand and double the number of fields or add an additional parking lot or put a building back there? So through the use of this tool, Mass Mapper, I can get at least a starting point for a conversation, and I can put on the wetland layers that are posted by Mass DEP, Department of Environmental Protection, and said through their aerial photo interpretation, they're assuming these green and blue spots are likely to be wetlands on the property. Now, let me back the train up one moment here. I deal with this every single day, that people are reviewing these individual maps relative to their properties and will say one of two things. Oh, my property shows that there's no wetlands on the Mass Mapper, so therefore there's no wetlands. Or my property shows that there's wetlands at this certain location, therefore there's wetlands at this certain location. These maps are not regulatorily binding. They are not accurate. It is routine that you see these maps are off plus or minus by tens to hundreds sometimes of feet. So just because on this map, for example, it shows we have some wetlands off the site to the left or to the west, and on site in that sort of southern zone, all of those areas could perhaps connect into one big system. They could be much larger than what you see there. They could be maybe not there at all, right? And so this map is a starting point, but it's not something to sort of take to the bank. This is always best field checked by a professional wetlands consultant who can advise and say, yes, this area is a wetland or it isn't a wetland. It's bigger or smaller than what's on the maps, because wetland science it's not the most precise science. There's a lot of professional interpretation too. So also you're going to find one wetland scientist might differ from another wetland scientist opinion. So let's assume then, for example, these wetland lines are accurate. and it's been verified, we'll go, boom, okay, all right, so it looks like I got an extra, maybe acre in there. Well, we got to think now, there's going to be some buffers off those zones, et cetera, but what other layers did I need to check? There's also a layer, remember the turtle picture at the beginning, the rare species maps. So I turn on this layer, pH priority habitat. This is telling me another piece of information. Okay, there might be some wetlands in there. There probably are some wetlands in there, but also this pH line, pH 1591, says this area is mapped by the state of Massachusetts through the Natural Heritage and Endangered Species Program for the presence of some rare species. Which is it? A turtle? Is it a plant? Is it a moth? What is it? We don't know. There's ways to get that information, but it's not publicly available through this database. But it does tell us this, that you see how that yellow line more or less follows the tree line? The way to interpret this is to say any work within that forested zone is likely going to trigger a permit through the Natural Heritage and Endangered Species Program. At the very least, a review process that also requires some assistance to go through and find out, can we use that area? Now, I wouldn't take this and jump immediately to the conclusion of, oh, it's not worth it. Oh, that land's useless. It's mapped for rare species. There's wetlands. I can't do anything. Before drawing that conclusion, it's worth doing a little bit more due diligence with some professional support to find out what can you get if you need additional land area to maximize the usability and value of your property. All right, so switching topics. I put this slide in here specifically with the mindset of commercial property owners, commercial/industrial, for existing property owners or prospective property owners, because stormwater basins are a hot button topic these days. So when I'm talking about a stormwater basin, I'm talking about a feature that was built in the ground at some point in the past, either with or without a permit from the Conservation Commission, built within or not within wetlands. Prior to 1996, you could build stormwater basins inside of wetlands. After 1996, you no longer can take an existing wetland and turn it into a stormwater basin. You have to create those basins outside of wetlands. But based on the timing of the creation of the basin, whether it was built with or without a permit, and how it's been maintained, those basins can sometimes become protected wetlands that may or may not be able to be altered with an appropriate permit. And some town bylaws regulate this different than the state of Massachusetts. So my point here is that if you allow a basin to go unmaintained and it develops wetland vegetation, wetland soils, it has the hydrology because they're partially or fully inundated for enough time during the year to look, smell, and act like a wetland, then in many cases, they can become something that becomes regulated and protected by the state of Massachusetts or the local conservation commission under a bylaw. And I've seen situations where you might have to create a basin adjacent to a basin to then discharge new stormwater. And now what are we doing? We're taking up a significant amount of land area. A lot of new commercial projects are deferring to subsurface storm drainage to eliminate this issue altogether. It's more expensive to build, but it maximizes the use of the land area when you go subsurface with your stormwater management. And what I mean by that is infiltration basins below parking lots, etc. But all that to say is, if you have a basin on your property or a property that you're looking at, it's worth having a professional review that with you to determine, is this something that would be treated as a wetland or not? Is there maintenance that needs to be done to this basin or not? What were the conditions on which this basin was created? Am I going to be able to alter this in the future, or is this going to become a protected zone that I no longer have the ability to incorporate into the commercial development only for stormwater management? So I just put that out there because this issue comes up all the time. Okay, so takeaways. prospective owners, existing owners. If you're an existing owner, I want you to think, where's opportunities to add value? Are there wetlands on my property? What do I need to know? I want to be well informed. Do I have basins on my site? Am I maintaining them right? Are they being treated as wetlands? Is this something I need to do right now to protect my investment in the future? Prospective owners, same questions, but just in the due diligence fashion, right? These are the questions you want to ask before you get there, not afterward. So I'll pause there so I don't take up too much time. I think we're going to wait till questions to the end, unless Harrison decides he wants to do some questions now, but I don't want to steal any more time from George than I already have.
I appreciate it, Scott. That was a great presentation. My big takeaway, that oftentimes I don't think of, and a lot of people don't think of. I think people think of wetlands as, puddles, water, and in reality, wetlands, as you did a great job explaining, can be plant species, can be different topographies, can be a lot of different things. So just because you walk out there and you don't need to put on your wading pants doesn't mean it's not a wetland. So absolutely, if you're thinking that you're going to take some steps with your land, call in a professional. It's really easy to, well, actually, I'll give you a quick chance to pitch it, Scott. What does it take to do a wetland flagging, right? It's a day out there, and I won't make you give me a number, but it's pretty quick, right?
Right. So there can be a desktop review right out of the gate. That's pretty easy. A field inspection just to put eyes on it makes all the difference in the world. And then going to the next level, which would be, sort of starting to engineer it by marking these things off in the ground, would be sort of the next level. So there's tiers of evaluation to do right out of the gate. So it's short money invested up front that can protect a lot of headaches on the back end.
I love it. I appreciate that, Scott. So going to George. George is co-running the ARCO Boston office. They're right in Framingham. He's got the Mass Pike with cars flying around in the snow behind him right now. ARCO has built many of the big giant buildings that you've seen as you're driving along the highways in Massachusetts and New England. This tilt-up construction product. They've also built a lot of high-tech space for the innovators in our market, and are now starting to get into multifamily development as well. I'll let George introduce himself, but we go to them when we have questions about what it costs to build something, what's on the site, what can fit on this site. So I wanted to have George on here today so he could share what he's been sharing with me with you guys.
Yeah, thanks, Harrison. I appreciate it a bunch, man. Yeah, so as Harrison said, I'm vice president here at the ARCO New England office, covering, again, as Harrison said, we're in Framingham. We cover all of New England. We have an Albany office that covers upstate New York. And then we've been here since 2018, been very fortunate to build almost 8 million square feet since 2018. A lot of that happening over, call it the COVID era, 2020 into the last couple of years, and kind of a pivot into, and that's what I'm going to talk about, a pivot into what today's world looks like from an industrial perspective. So let me see if I can do this, Liz. I don't know how you get me to the next slide here. So we're a national design build general contractor, heavily involved in the industrial cold storage, advanced manufacturing, light manufacturing, a ton of different product types. And as Harrison said, we have offices all over the country that allow us to chase what those local markets require. Obviously in Boston, again, on a cyclical nature, you go through, we went through an industrial era. Now we're into kind of more of a housing era. Always a manufacturing, very intelligent people in this market. So for us, it's been kind of a continuous transition of, how we diversify in our market. So again, we have offices in 47 locations, overall almost 100 operating businesses nationally to really, work with Boston-based clients that also take us into the Research Triangle, that take us out west into San Diego, that take us across the nation, work in Southern Texas. So all different pieces and parts of it. Liz, if you have the next one, and a lot of what we do in our markets, if you go back one more, a lot of what we do is to Harrison's point, is help assess sites, compatibility with different buildings that we've either built or are going to be doing tenant improvements in, working with a lot of end users, working with a lot of different brokerage groups, to kind of provide a lot of upfront expertise that allows us to really help people at a zero cost basis before they go make any huge financial outlays. So, pieces like geotechnical report reviewing, environmental, working with Scott and his team. We've been fortunate to work with Scott and his team on quite a few different deals where, from our perspective, we are representing the client. We're asking, can you challenge the buffer zones? Can you challenge the different wetlands delineation that's been set forth? And then if we can't, then what do we do there? How do we address it? How do we manage it? We have a different group that falls under our umbrella that helps with a lot of site layout. And so for us, putting buildings on plans and trying to work through a pro forma and make sure that makes sense. So, we do a lot of that work as kind of a cost of doing business. So that's what Harrison and his team and we've gone, kind of over this region and nationally looking at what that looks like and making sure that there's different ways to add value to your guys' businesses. So, Liz, if you have the next one, I just want to do a quick recap of what the last, call it 5 years, have looked like. So, if you guys can see, and to Scott's point, over 2020, 21, 22, a lot of the requests that we had were let's max FAR. Let's encroach on the maximum limits of the buffer zones, no disturb zones, and build as big of a building as we possibly can. And in a lot of ways, that was a great approach. And a lot of these buildings are leasing up now, and the tenant activity is addressing that. But we really focus on a lot of site costs. And to Scott's point, a lot less detention areas, a lot more maximizing underground detention, and really it was a build as big as you can. Liz, if you go to the next slide. Then over the next year or so was more of an address of build-to-suit end users were the only ones doing a lot of the builds. There's still speculative buildings going out there. There's a lot of people still making great decisions, but we started doing a lot more purpose-built use for end users. So buildings got, in some ways, a little smaller. They got a little bit more complex. They got a little bit less institutionalized from the fact of it's trying to address their operations, not some speculative build that we don't know. So you get, more focus on how do products go in and out, what are they trying to accomplish? And in essence, a lot of that ended up being smaller buildings with very specific user requirements. Liz, if you go to the next slide. Then we started to go into more of the, if we're going back to spec, the buildings got smaller, a little bit of whatever term you wanted to use, flex space, small bay, really a lot of it was how do we approach leasing velocity for 60,000 square feet and less, or 75,000 square feet or less. And so buildings that, 2 years prior were going to be a bigger bomber, ended up sacrificing some of that square footage, some of that, just large, everything under one roof. We really want 2 buildings. End users were asking for standalone buildings or one tenant rather than trying to fit in with 5 or 6 tenants. If you go to the next slide, Liz. Then we get into a little bit more of the, I'll call it, modern day small bay-ish. Let's get the buildings to fit on it, but really feel like we're able to fit 2 very specific tenants in these spaces. They need less dock doors. We're still trying to approach a 1 per 10,000 dock door position, but they may only use 2. And so that dock apron area ends up becoming less focus on what's truck turning movements. And if we can get 2 or 3 trucks in here every day, we're perfectly happy. And let's use the rest for either storage or car parking. Next slide there. And then what that turned into is, how do we focus on addressing tenant needs? Before when you'd have one 4,000 amp service, you'd come into a switchgear or a panel, and it's like, we'll figure it out later. Hopefully we have one tenant. There's a lot more planning up front to how do we demise this correctly? How do we address tenants occupying the space from an electrical perspective, a water perspective, a gas utility connection side? So, we're really trying to focus more on upfront due diligence, not just within the building walls, but also conversations with National Grid, Eversource, the water utility companies, the local DPWs. So a lot of our business has shifted locally to those conversations, us being heavily involved in those conversations up front. And then as you go, now what we would have tried to shift and fit one big larger building on a site, we're looking at, multiple smaller buildings, a lot more car parking, a lot more, in my opinion, the way, that I look at these are, call it higher power users, different groups that are doing manufacturing, research and development, that don't necessarily need a lot of space, but the offices get a little bit larger, the man count ends up getting a little larger. We're not trying to focus on where are the forklifts traversing in this space. We're looking at how do you fit the most people in the space to do, a high paying, relatively higher education job. And obviously, I think as everyone understands, that's really what Massachusetts and New England offers, is a continuous labor pool of high educated people. A lot of different businesses in the pharmaceutical and advanced manufacturing side that are looking for space. And, a lot of it over the last couple of years, I think we all felt the difficulties of those people just weren't moving spaces, but we're starting to see that velocity come up more. The timing obviously drives some of the decision-making process for, having to get involved in these deals earlier and making sure that, we're not just trying to move into a space every 3 months. We're trying to focus on a year out. And as you go to the last item there, Liz, same thing. Again, what we would have tried to fit one larger building on with a cross dock now has such a little need. And this isn't for every site, don't get me wrong, guys, but at the same time, they need 2 or 3 docks. They're not moving product in and out all the time. They're bringing some product in, manufacturing it, creating a finished product, putting it out on a box truck and shipping it out. So again, site constraints are still absolutely evident. At the same time, it's less about maxing out the building and maximizing, what your future tenant needs are. And I would say the buildings are getting a little bit sexier. There's still concrete panel, there's still metal panel, still insulated metal panel, but the desire for creating more aesthetically pleasing buildings that have the square footage under roof, but look more, I would say European in some ways, but just research. They look to have more of a research look, more windows, more glass. I would say in this market, we're still not approaching any sort of clear story skylights. But in other markets, that's heavy, try to get natural light in the space. But just again, buildings that have a little bit more of an aesthetically pleasing view.
George, why are you seeing that? Is that an expectation of a different tenanting, or just trying to put a little bit more money in so you can win the tenants that are there?
A little bit of both. Tenants are asking for whether or not you do this day one. We're seeing a lot more of a request for let's build the building with the flexibility of knockouts. Where you can cut out a wall panel and put glazing. Whether or not you do that day one under the overall build cost, or you shift it to a tenant, or you just carry it as a carrying cost for later on the project. But we're just seeing more and more users not want a single 6x7 storefront door. And they don't care if there's a single window in the building, because those are the industrial users. So as these buildings get built the same way, the users coming into it are looking more for a conversion from an office space that, where they're trying to go under one roof. Or we're seeing a lot of, as we see onshoring in this space, we're also seeing the desire for research and development is steps away, not miles away. Where, you get an office component, you get something that looks like a corporate space. But, 10 steps later, you walk through the demised wall, there's your actual manufacturing area. Then I think on some of the hot terms here, guys, small bay, right? I think for a while we kind of called this flex space, flex buildings. Small bay has been what kind of the accepted term recently is. But in essence, what it is, it's just smaller buildings that the priority of solely industrial storage is less so, and it's more of leasing velocity with users. More focus on splitting these spaces up. Harrison could have a much better stat than me on, I don't know the stat, but the number of leases that get signed 50,000 square feet and less versus 50 or 75,000 square feet or more has got to be a tremendous amount. So having that flexibility. And again, the use ends up looking a little bit different, where you may build a 50,000 square foot building with end walls, all the way around to attract 25,000 square foot users. when before our thought in a lot of ways was just build a big demising wall. But those users want an end cap. They want the corner offices. They want the ability to be a little bit more isolated, and their desire to share a space with one person is more accommodating than to share it with 4 or 5. Again, some users, we see as we get some of these trades, the companies and that are more focused in the trades, they don't care as much. They could share it with 10 different people. It doesn't matter as much to them. But again, what it's driving is higher office finishes. In a lot of ways, office finishes day one. Building a small office that's permitted, whether you build 500 square feet, 1,000 square feet, let that go in. So again, from a leasing velocity, they're able to move in. If they need to expand the office, that's a separate permitting side. But at the same time, we're not just building a shell and saying, hey, we'll wait, 12 to 16 weeks to go permit this, build it before anyone can move in. They can move in day one. It just may not be the space that they exactly need yet. Yeah, and then you guys can read the different slide there. But again, multi-tenant flexibility, I kind of alluded to this earlier. What we're seeing a tremendous amount of requirements for are, aside from different tenants going to space and trying to demise it, is figuring out a better way of managing gas utility, electric utility, water utility, and how that looks. And again, as prior, where you just had one large electrical service or gas service, and then there was potentially triple net or split it into square footage of the building. A lot of these utility companies are starting to push back a little bit on that and requesting that we clean that up. So it looks like either 2 services or the tenanting may be uniquely Eversource or uniquely National Grid on how they want to see that. So we're starting to kind of get a lot more involved earlier. We've always been early on just trying to go get the power, but the conversations are a little bit more evolved now based on the fact that we're trying to talk about metering. How do they expect the metering to go? How do they expect the number of tenants and the billings to go? So again, it's kind of driving conversations a little bit differently than it was before. It was just give us 4,000 amps, we'll put one switch gear, we'll put a panel in there, and we'll figure it out later. Some questions we get a lot, especially as these buildings are a little bit smaller, are, what's a pre-engineered metal building versus a tilt up? What's that inflection point of where it makes sense to do tilt? And I'll go to a little bit more explanation of tilt for anyone that doesn't know, versus a pre-engineered metal building, which pre-engineered metal buildings, there's only so many of those builders in the country. They are fabricators, they are the engineers, and they're pretty much shipping a box. They're going to ship it the way it is. It's purpose built for whatever we tell them up front, and it's hard to go and make a bunch of different changes to it after the fact, because again, it's pre-engineered. So the adding of HVAC units, the adding of openings, the requirements for sharing that with the initial builder becomes paramount, because making a change in an opening could change the structural capacity of the building. There are 100% purposes for pre-engineered metal buildings that are beneficial. But as you get larger, some of the institutional grade kind of lends itself more to tilt panels and structural steel buildings. Again, we see the inflection point of usually anything 30,000 square feet or smaller is kind of best for pre-engineered metal buildings, because then you don't have a large crane erecting, you don't have some of the steel in different pieces. It's kind of more integral to it. But overall, tilt up for us as kind of a national builder that has resources nationally, but both locally, that we use a lot of different groups, concrete groups locally, but also national ability. We're able to do tilt up at a smaller scale, more cost effectively. So you get a little bit of that as well. And then just so everyone understands the difference between tilt up and precast, they're both tilt up wall panels. But what we consider tilt up would be the panels are cast on site. So where you in essence have to pour the floor slab, cast the panel on the floor horizontally, and then you have a large crane like you guys can see in the photo, erect it vertically. Precast is manufactured off-site. In this market, that's usually coming from either New York or Pennsylvania, through a couple of different groups. Those things are manufactured in a plant under roof. They're stacked horizontally in a yard off-site, and then they're trucked in, usually 2 or 3 panels at a time, and they're erected usually in 8 to 12 foot widths. So a little bit different, but precast, you benefit from having integral insulation. Tilt up is usually a surface applied insulation, so a stick pin or a rigid board that is visible. So again, not one way or the other, but precast is usually a little bit more expensive on the larger scale. But on some of the smaller scale where you don't have a lot of the laydown area, you may not even have room for a crane. Precast may be a good driving factor there. And then just one of the other terms that's getting floated around a lot more, industrial outdoor storage, IOS. I would say in our market, it's always going to get floated just because people are interested in groups like Amazon as they build. You know, there's potential that they build a facility and outgrow their capacity to park their vans or their trucks. And so they're going to look at a different site or an underutilized site to park it. Again, I would say there's other markets, namely along the East Coast, that has a lot more IOS potential because land's cheaper, right? For us, it makes more sense to build the buildings on there and have some overflow capacity on some of the parking, but to pay the land prices and then just have parking or outdoor storage or laydown areas hasn't been as cost effective as what we've seen in other markets. But again, as you guys can see, and really as Scott kind of alluded to, you're really managing the site on this. You're paying obviously a relatively large sum of money, but what you're really focused on is drainage. Where's that water going? How's it being managed in your wetlands? Different municipalities sometimes don't like the coverage ratios of that amount of water runoff. It's a pretty large transition from what the virgin land look like to what the build looks like. So you get some of that. Again, I would say it's always an important term to know. There are certainly groups that are doing this very well. There's groups in this market that are doing this well. And I think, what was built 3 or 4 years ago, to kind of speak to Scott's point of underutilized existing properties, there is the potential of, areas of trees and forested areas that don't have any current use that, as long as it can get permitted and accepted by the town, could be a dual purpose area for a user or for a client, or I'm sorry, a building owner to put IOS and share that with local small trade companies or larger companies that need laydown area or overflow parking. So Harrison, that's all I had from my side. I just wanted to kind of walk through, some of the terms and what we've been seeing in our market. But I will kick it back to you, brother.
I appreciate it. I think that's a great overview of what we're seeing from a construction standpoint. I like that we're seeing prettier buildings around here. I think all of those tilt-up buildings looked really good in 2020 when we first started seeing them come out of the ground, and then we ended up with a lot of them, and they started looking somewhat predictable. So I'm excited to see some more interesting looking buildings getting put up once the snow melts.
Yep.
I wanted to wrap this up quickly, talking about my side of the business. So what we do is we sell office industrial buildings and land generally located within an hour and a half of Boston. So we go to Providence, we go to Springfield, we go to Hartford sometimes, we go up into New Hampshire. And so when we look at land, the first thing we try and figure out is what can be built there. So we frequently will throw around the word dollars per buildable foot. So at the peak of the market in 2022 and 2023, maybe we were seeing some really high quality land where you can put up a 100,000 square foot box. It would be worth $100 a buildable foot. So you get $10 million for a piece of land that you can build 100,000 feet on. And then when construction costs went up, financing costs went up, cap rates moved, everything shifted around, that number came down considerably. I'm not going to get into exactly what land is worth. It's so different by market to market. But if you're trying to guess, what's my land worth, first thing you got to ask is what's going to be done with it, right? Are we turning it into apartments? Are we turning it into industrial? Are we turning it into IOS? That's going to be what determines it. Price per acre is nice. It's maybe useful in certain situations. But if you have 10 acres and 7 of them it is wetlands that you can't use, price per acre is not relevant. The other thing that we've got to look at when we sell land is what are the site work going to look like? So we sold a property in West Boylston a few years back that had almost 100 feet of grade change. You basically had to take down a mountain. And the people that bought it are doing that. We sold it to a site work company. They're doing a great job on that property. but it's different than a flat site, right? You got to take, what do I buy the land for? And then add on top of that, what's it going to cost me to get ready to put a building on that site? That's where people like Scott come in, people that do geotechnical studies come in, your site work contractors come in and can say, order of magnitude, it's flat, it's easy, let's go break ground, or it's going to cost you $5 million to get there. I often say if there's a good 100-acre parcel that was easy to build on in New England, it would have been built on 100 years ago, right? Most of the land that is left has some kind of quirks to it. There's not a ton of easy land that's not already built on, but we have great people that can help with that. And there's a huge difference between a site that is worthless, unbuildable, and a site that's maybe a little bit tricky. So this is what we do back in the napkin development models for owners when they come to me and say, Harrison, what's my site worth? The first thing I do is say, if you haven't talked to someone like Scott, you got to talk to someone like Scott and figure out, are there wetlands? Are there endangered species? What can we lay out? Then we talk to a design build person, see how much building can get on this site. And then we're working through a model like this where we say, maybe you're a 0.4 FAR. So meaning for every 10,000 square feet of land, you can put up 4,000 square feet of building, 75,000 square feet of buildable space, right? That's where we talk about what we're pricing on. Then we basically are working back to this land cost number. So we look at construction, maybe at 115 a foot, maybe it's 150 a foot, maybe it's 90 if you're building a giant building. Is there some environmental cleanup that has to be done? That'd be another line item. Site work, that's things like removing ledge, leveling out a site, replicating wetlands that you may have to do. Soft cost is our great zoning attorneys, our entitlement folks. Capital is, you're going to likely have a construction loan. What's that going to cost you over a year or two of building the property? What's your leasing fee, right? So all in here on this random made up model, we're saying it's going to cost you $15 million or $200 a square foot to build this building. And then we look at, well, once you build it, what's the building worth, right? So if I can lease this building for $15 a square foot, triple net, get a little bit of the loss factor there of 2%, then I think this building's going to rent for $1.116 million. And I think I could then go out and sell it at a 6.25 cap or 17 million less a $270,000 brokerage fee. So I'm netting out $17.6 million. So in this simplified example, it cost me $15 million to build it. 17 million and a half is what I'm selling it for. So I've made $2.5 million bucks. Again, we're oversimplifying this, but this is a deal that reasonably could work, right? I could pay you $3 million for this land if I think I can put up a building, sell that building at a profit, and do this. For our larger sites, this is typically how we're underwriting. We're saying this will make sense for a developer. A developer can build a building, either build to suit, meaning that they have a tenant in hand already, or speculatively, meaning they're going to go find a tenant in a way that will make this a profitable project. We also look at a number of smaller sites. Maybe you're building 10,000, 20,000, 40, 50,000 square feet on the site where these numbers don't work at all, right? You look at this and you say, it's going to cost me $250 a foot to build a building that's going to be worth $200. In that scenario, we start looking at build-to-suit projects, meaning that someone like ARCO will come in and build the building for a particular user that wants to own that building, or they'll pay an above market rent to lease that building. Lots and lots and lots of buildings are built that don't make sense economically, except for that one tenant. And that may be the case with your property. Next slide. So that takes it down to build, sell, or hold, right? You own this land. There's 10 acres that are sitting in your backyard behind your warehouse. You found out that they're, not all wetlands, right? There's something there of value, right? You can put a building on the site. Does it make sense to build that building for you or for someone else? Does it make sense for you to sell that land? Maybe there's someone else that's better suited to build it than you are. Maybe an owner occupant will pay you more for that land than a developer would, so you go and you sell it to that owner occupant. Or maybe the right thing to do is just to hold. We've told a lot of people to hold onto their land over the last 2 or 3 years, right? A lot of people that were maybe offered $10 million in 2022, and then all of a sudden the offers were coming in at $3 million because the market just isn't as attractive now as it was a few years ago when interest rates were really low and there were a ton of tenants for these buildings. Maybe the right thing to do is just simply wait, let it sit there. Pay the taxes for another 3 or 4 or 5 years and do nothing. All three of these can be the right scenario. It simply depends upon what your incentives are, what the market's doing, and when you want to make your move. That's something that we can help with, though, giving you the information with us, with people like Scott, with groups like George's that are able to show you what can I do with my site, what are the financial implications of that process, and then you as the owner make a decision of, should I do something to build it? Should I go out and sell it and let someone else build it? Or do I simply do nothing and wait a few years? So I'm glad we're able to have everyone here today. If anyone has any questions, we're happy to answer. And feel free to reach out to any of us if you have questions in the future, if you've got projects that you're interested in, or just want to learn a little bit more. One thing I did have a question from someone on George. As far as small bay, are you guys starting to see people that are, I'm sure you're seeing people that are looking at it. How does it compare to building a single big box?
Just from how it gets built, or from a cost perspective?
From a cost and a timing perspective, actually. So maybe how long does it take to, if we've got an entitled site to build a single 100,000 square foot building, how does that timing differ versus if you are trying to put that into a 10-unit building or something like that?
Yeah, good question there. So, I mean, generally, depending if you're building office build outs, really going to be your driving factor. If you have 100,000 square foot single use, I mean, depending on the site complexities, we're going to say that's going to take 10 months. A small bay that is a similar size is probably 12 months, because you're going to build 10 separate office build outs. Small.
Yeah.
It's going to take a little bit more time to delineate the utilities, but yeah, I mean, you're very similar. But then if you're going to go build smaller 10,000 square foot, buildings, that's going to fall along a similar timeline, 10 to 12 months. But you're going to be able to phase those constructions in a different way, where the first 5 buildings are going to be up, within 5 or 6 months, and then the final 5 would come later. So there's some uniqueness to how you underwrite that and how it gets permitted and approved. Yeah, there are a couple of different ways to approach it.
I appreciate it. Well, thank you everyone for being on this call. This is really insightful to me. I kind of put these on to educate myself, and I hope that other people get some use out of this. We'll send out the recording, and if anyone has any questions, feel free to out to any of us for that information. Thanks again, guys.